Hello everyone, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this webinar. My name is Katie from Meridian and I will be today's host. In today's webinar we will be discussing why companies should audit travel expense claims. This is going to be the first in a series of webinars which will give you some hints and tips and allow us to share best practice around managing this process. I'm sitting here today with Anne-Marie Purcell and Wim Devabai. Anne-Marie has been with Meridian for nearly 14 years and leads the project management and service delivery teams. She has extensive experience in the travel and expense world across a wide range of industries. Wim is the commercial manager for Meridian's Expenseflo service. Wim has been with Meridian for over 5 years and is responsible for developing new business. He has a background in managed services, finance systems and IT. His business development experience spans over 20 years and has worked with some of the largest and most complex businesses globally. Hi Anne-Marie, hi Wim.
Hi Katie, nice to be with you today.
Hi Katie, pleasure to be here.
Okay, so let's kick off with you, Wim. So what is an expense claim audit?
Well, an expense claim audit is a back office service which ensures full trip expenses are audited and complies with both regulatory and travel policy requirements. The service should help to reduce T&E spend and increase compliance with travel policy. The audit should also ensure key data is captured correctly and accurately, which will maximise VAT compliance, and the audit should provide a positive user experience with timely notifications and a consistent approach to queries and escalations. An expense audit process comprises of the following: a submission made by the traveller, the claim being received by the auditor, a full audit and compliance check, that's every single line, and any querying should be tracked, traced and notified to the traveller. And then once that's done, a notification back to the traveller to say that the expense report is moving on to the next process, be that approval by a manager or payment. And the service should include some form of scanning of receipts and invoices, and lastly, but very importantly, a complete VAT compliance check as well.
Okay. Following on from that explanation there, Anne-Marie, why do companies carry out audit and expense claims?
Well, I suppose expenses are an area of the company that can be very prone to error or indeed fraud. If you think about any other situation where an employee is spending money on behalf of the company, so purchases of raw materials or services, there's a whole purchase order and accounts process. But when it comes to travel and expenses, the company is relying on the employee to travel wisely and effectively, and then also report correctly on their own spend via the expenses process. So if a company isn't auditing the expenses, you're relying fully on the employee to be claiming honestly and correctly. And you can of course build rules into your expense management system, but those are only as good as the information entered by the employee. So, rubbish in, rubbish out. If the employee doesn't enter the correct information, the rules won't be flagged and therefore you're not doing any checks. An audit is where you look at the actual invoice that the employee has submitted and compare it to what they're claiming to make sure it's valid. You're checking the amount is correct. You're checking the nature of the spend is correct. So if the employee says they have a taxi for 20 euros, then there is a receipt and it's a taxi receipt and it's for 20 euros. Most expense management systems will route an expense to the manager for approval, but the reality is managers aren't looking in that level of detail. So as to why your question was, why do companies need to audit? The only way to guarantee that expense claims are for valid business spends is by checking them at that level.
Okay, and following on from that, companies that do this, why is it usually not effective?
Well, now, there's the question. To explain that, I need to talk to you a little bit about the finance world and the accounts payable world. So in accounts payable, T&E is it's considered the black sheep of the accounts payable family, and it's a task that no one really wants. I'll explain why. If you underpay a supplier in the normal course of events in accounts payable, then you simply ring up the supplier, you explain you've made a mistake, and you'll say you'll pay them next month, and it's no problem. It's not personal. But when it comes to expenses, the most placid and sometimes the most senior of people can lose all sense of reason when it comes to their expenses, particularly if you make a mistake. And you can bet any mistake or any question or even any deduction you make, it will be escalated and sometimes out of all proportion. So as a result, it's often the most junior member of the team who's given the job of doing the audit. And if they see any claims that are a bit funny or mistaken, even if it's for a small value, they'd have to be a very brave person to challenge a colleague and particularly challenge a senior colleague. So often a lot of spend is not audited as effectively as it should be. And while it might only be a few euros or a few pounds here and there, it all escalates. And that's really why internal audits sometimes aren't really as good as they should be.
Okay, going back over to you, Vim. Why is expense auditing so important today?
Well, organisations are investing in expense management systems to make it easier for their travellers to claim for business travel expenses, which is great for the travellers. So, what's the issue? Well, the ease of submitting claims for the traveller is leading to an increase in the volume of claims being submitted within organisations. This is placing a huge burden on the finance, tax and compliance teams. They're facing increased challenges around VAT, tax legislation and communication with travellers, in particular language support for global businesses and managing different travel policies as well. The increase in the volume of claims has impacted the number of mistakes from the traveller as well as the increase in queries, ultimately leading to either slower reimbursement to the traveller and expenses being paid with a minimum of checks. There are lots of studies and surveys which prove that this leads to overpayments, non-compliance of company policy and VAT, and for travellers feeling that it's okay to claim that little bit extra.
Right, okay. And leading on from that, Anne-Marie, what are the risks of not auditing expense claims?
Well, I suppose if you're not doing any audit on the expense claims, employees will notice and they will take advantage. The vast majority of employees are completely honest, but it's only too easy to add a little extra here and there to your expenses. So claiming mileage for 120 miles instead of 100, or maybe adding a tip to a taxi that maybe you didn't give. And each mistake might only be, say, €5 or £5. But if you've 50,000 expense claims, suddenly it's €250,000, and that's a lot of money. If the employees know that someone is checking their expense claims, they will alter their behaviour accordingly. Of course they will. The other thing you have to bear in mind, as well as the risk of fraud, is that companies spend a lot of time and money, HR departments spend a lot of effort putting policies in place. But you need someone to check that those policies are being applied. The system rules will do so much, but someone needs to look at the actual invoices. I'll give you a classic example that we see an awful lot. A lot of the policies I review have written into them that if you're renting a car, you don't need to take any of the extra insurances, the collision damage waiver or whatever they're called. But all too often employees get to the arrivals halls, they're renting their car and they're added all of these optional extras and they just say yes, it's not their money, so unfortunately that's what happens. In Meridian, if we see that someone is claiming for something that's not allowed via the policy, we're going to send an email to the employee reminding them that the policy says they shouldn't have claimed it, asking them to justify why they felt it was needed, and then ultimately the employee is going to get reimbursed for that spend. But the very fact that we have queried them and asked them to justify it and also pointed out the policy means that the employees will see the policy in future and remember it, and you would hope the next time they would say, okay, I must remember this. But also they make very much aware that someone is checking their expenses. So really, if you're not doing any audit, the risk is that employees are overclaiming and also not claiming within the policy.
Okay, I guess off the back of that, I have a question for the both of you, and that is, do you see much fraud? Vim, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, a great question. Well, employees who have the opportunity to exploit weaknesses in an organisation's expense reimbursement process and procedures can do so. Moreover, anti-fraud experts agree that expense reimbursement fraud can be among the most difficult types of employee crime to detect and prevent. That is in large part due to the extraordinary variety of ways in which such crimes can be committed.
Okay, and Anne-Marie?
Well, whenever I'm asked this by a client or by anyone, I always say, no, we in Meridian don't see any fraud, and obviously that raises a few eyebrows. But the reality is that it's like in a supermarket. If you're going around a supermarket and you put something in your pocket, it's not fraud until you go outside the supermarket. In the same way, in the audit, if we find someone is claiming for, say, €100 and they've only got a receipt for €10, it's not fraud until they've actually been reimbursed the money. And what we will do in Meridian, if we see this, is reject the expense claim and send a nice polite note back to the employee saying they've made a mistake. And we always take the attitude, oh, look, dear employee, you've made a mistake. That way the employee can correct it and they can save face, as it were. But they'll also know, as well as we've prevented the fraud, they'll also know that someone is watching their expenses and checking in that level of detail. So that is definitely a detriment for the future. That's not to say we haven't seen fraud. We see it, unfortunately. Employees adding extra ones and zeros. Sometimes it's so badly done, a 5-year-old spotted, using a blue pen on a black and white invoice. In reality, as Vim said, there are lots of different ways, and employees are clever. So if someone is very determined to be fraudulent, they will probably be successful. Our job is just to make it as hard as humanly possible. On those lines, we recently had a very interesting situation. One of our team got an envelope within the expenses, and it contained €200 and a little nice polite note asking the auditor to ignore the fact that the employee had purchased flights for their whole family. Needless to say, our auditor didn't keep the money, didn't ignore it, and that person is now an ex-employee. So, see a bit of everything, Katie.
Okay, right. Thank you for that insight, Anne-Marie. I'll pass it back to you now with another question. What is wrong with sample and percentage audits?
Well, I suppose there's nothing wrong with them per se, but it depends on your organisation. So let me give you, for example, an organisation who has local VAT configured into their expense management system. If you do, then it's very important that you have a 100% audit, because someone needs to check that the employee has split their expenses correctly and allocated their expenses correctly. For example, in a lot of countries, there are different VAT rates on a single type of invoice. In Germany, typically on hotels, you have one VAT rate for accommodation and one VAT rate for breakfast. If the employee has entered the hotel invoice as a single line item, the system will only apply one VAT rate, and if you post that, it's wrong. And any situation where you're not declaring the right VAT is a risky situation. So as part of the audit, we check the invoice and check the split has been done correctly, and where it hasn't been done correctly, we will correct that. So if you're doing a percentage audit, you won't be checking every invoice and you could be declaring wrong VAT. Even in situations where you don't have multiple VAT rates, because some countries might say, well, that doesn't apply to me, the VAT rate in the system is allocated based on the expense type. But what you also have to have backing that up for it to be valid is a valid invoice. So there are different regulations in different countries. It might need to be invoiced to the company name and address. So as part of the Meridian audit, we're checking the actual invoice has been issued correctly. And if it hasn't, we're flagging that and changing the VAT so that you're not posting VAT correctly. But as I say, that's a reason why if you have VAT that you need to keep the audit at 100%. If you don't have VAT in country or it's not built into your system, you certainly want to start with 100% compliance, because you want to get employees trained into the notion that someone is looking at their expenses, a kind of big brother is watching you. Then over time, as your compliance gets better and better, you can reduce your percentage audit. And finally, you know your own business best. You have to look at what's the nature of your business. If you have a lot of staff turnover, it means everyone is starting afresh, so it's going to be a lot more non-compliance. You might want to always keep the percentage rate fairly high. Likewise, if you're a company that does a lot of acquisitions, you might want to keep the percentage rate very high. If you're a company who simply has a lot of employees who don't look at the rules, you might want to keep your rate very high. You kind of have to judge it for your company and your circumstances.
Okay. And then I'll just pass back over to you, Vim. So can you tell me about the impact of VAT for expenses?
Yeah, so VAT submitted in your local VAT returns and foreign VAT reclaims should be accurate, and the posting for the spend category is precise regardless of what has been entered by the employees. Therefore, checking and using and carrying out a compliant audit service obviously works. And local VAT authorities are becoming more focused around travel and expense VAT claims, and make sure claims are accurate and the supporting documentation is available is also very important. Reporting from this end-to-end process should provide true strategic data visibility. Integration of all the components, your online booking tools, your travel management company, your payment systems, your expense management systems, and finance systems will be required. VAT recovery is a complex business, and the benefits for organisations can seem outweighed by the burden of the process. And at Meridian, we believe that expense management doesn't stop at the submission or even the approval of an expense report.
Okay. And how does the audit increase local VAT, Anne-Marie?
Well, Katie, the audit has a huge impact on your local VAT because I suppose the very core component of an audit is checking that there is an invoice for, attached by the employee for every single line item. And if you don't have an invoice, you simply can't claim VAT. So where there are lots of missing invoices, you're also missing out on a lot of VAT as well. But the second core check that we're doing is making sure that if the employee has attached an invoice, that's a real and valid invoice. So things like a credit card slip, like an estimate, like a pro forma, while all of those might be valid to pay the employee and reimburse them, they're not valid for VAT. So part of our audit is not just checking there is an invoice, but that the invoice attached by the employee is the correct type of invoice. I'll give you a typical example that perhaps people aren't aware of. If you're staying in a hotel overnight, normally when you get up in the morning, you'll find an envelope has been put under the door and the hotel has issued you an invoice. So that means you don't have to check out the next day. And for most of us who stay in places, you might not have any extra spend, so it's very handy you just walk out the next day. The problem is that's not a real invoice, so you can't claim VAT on that. The hotels do this is because they want in the afternoon at 2 or 3 o'clock when it's nice and quiet, they'll officially check you out then. And it's only when they officially check you out then that the invoice is generated. But of course you're not there, so no invoice goes anywhere. What you took away that morning is a pro forma. So what we do as part of the audit is when we see a pro forma, we make sure the company is not claiming the VAT on that because they can't. But also we'll send a reminder to the employee asking them to make sure to do the official checkout the next time. It's an inconvenience for the employee, but it's very important, particularly because hotel spend tends to be high value, and in most countries that's a recoverable. So that's where the audit will generate extra VAT by making sure there is actually an invoice in the first place, and secondly, that it's a proper invoice.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Marie. Vim, I'll wrap up with you and send the final question to yourself. Why is compliance so important, and what is worrying finance directors and tax directors?
Yeah, well, most companies, and in fact the companies that we deal with, have invested in setting up shared service centres, both regional and with accounts payable teams to manage all finance processes. This is sound investment for a lot of organisations and can lead to improvements both operationally and building defined teams to manage standard core finance processes. However, due to the nature and complexity of an expense claim and the time taken to validate and check these claims, can be more than a standard format invoice from a vendor. This leads to what we call the hidden factory, where the finance teams and senior management are spending a disproportionate amount of time on this non-core finance activity. And in order to get the right process in place, they would need to create a dedicated expense audit team, train them on the latest tax and VAT rules. And don't forget, the EU has 28 member states, each one a different VAT system. And more countries globally are introducing VAT systems such as Brazil, India and the United Arab Emirates. Organisations will also need to make sure they have multiple language capability and build a system which can manage the queries for all the employees. Now, and this is the reason why so many companies are coming to Meridian, to help take away the worry and pain this process creates.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne-Marie and Vim, for joining me today. That was a very interesting session and it was very insightful. To anyone who's listening today, please make sure to join us for the next part in this series, which will be how does Meridian audit expense claims. Also, if you have any questions or would like to talk to someone from Meridian, please send on any queries using the information provided. And all details should now be up on your screen.